One of the blessings of retirement that I'm enjoying right now is that I'm able to spend hours a day studying the Bible, using time that I didn't have necessarily before to the degree that I have it now, and capturing some of the 40 plus years of notes that I've written in the margins in ink that's starting to fade. So I'm trying to capture all that because it contains the wisdom, not of myself, but of many, many people who have helped instruct me as I've gone my Christian journey of all kinds of preachers from different places and gospel meetings and Bible studies and all of that. So while doing that, I really rekindled my interest in Matthew 24. And I wanted to put together a sermon for this. And aligning to that, on Tuesday, the duty roster came out for November, and my name wasn't on it, and so I emailed Eddie, which I can do since he's my in-law. And I mentioned, I've gone through the website, and I've checked virtually every box as I'm here to work, and so please keep that in mind, and also if there's any opportunities to preach. And he said, how about Sunday night? And so here I am. But I want to give credit to certain preachers, including Eddie, who have helped me navigate this chapter. This chapter has been described as a breeding ground for all kinds of error, and so I take a great concern of bringing a lesson. It's a long chapter, and I'm going to try to do it justice in the time allotted, and still give something that's hopefully a benefit to you all. So included in Matthew 24 is the popular idea that it's entirely about the end of the world, Christ's second coming, and or the so-called rapture. So tonight's 3 words are actually a phrase found in verse 34 of Matthew 24. And by the way, you don't have to go jumping around tonight. We're going to stick with Matthew 24. But the 3 words are all these things, where I believe this is a key verse and a key phrase to understanding this chapter, because many events up to verse 34, of all those events, they are time boxed to take place before this generation passes away. That is, the generation of the people that Jesus was speaking to. Parallel accounts to this chapter are in Mark 13 and parts of Luke 21 and 17. And while the other accounts are subsets and in various different orders, and in the case of Luke, it's split between 2 separate events, each of these helps shed light on the others and to help reconcile what might seem as difficult verses. So I will ask you all to please put on your thinking caps for this. It is a meaty topic to chew on, and we have toothpicks in the back. No, we don't. Afterwards, we don't really. And I'm not going to pound the podium on all the conclusions that I have, not only so I don't hurt my hand, but also because I recognize that these are difficult concepts. And I think we all recognize that many have made a living off of widely pontificating on this chapter. And so I want to make sure it's clear that I have no personal agenda in bringing this lesson other than to share the truth. I'm not trying to be controversial by picking a controversial chapter, and I don't claim to have all the answers. And if you have a difficult time understanding or a different understanding of what I'm saying, please feel free to talk with me afterwards. So quickly, the setting for Matthew 24, as we lead into the reading, which I'll do in a moment, Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem for the last time. He has heated exchanges with religious leaders there. He pronounces all kinds of woes, and he predicts the temple's destruction. Okay, so that's what we're leading into, getting into this chapter. Now, as far as the chapter goes, I feel like I need to read it. It's a lot of verses, but I think I need to read it to make sure that we all have it fresh in our mind. So please turn with me to Matthew 24 and follow along. Jesus came out from the temple, and he was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, Do you not all see these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us when these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered and said to them, See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on their housetop must not go down to get things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back and get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no one would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels and with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, nor the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like in the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. Be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master has put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to eat and beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there's a lot happening in this chapter. But the question is, when will these things happen? Are they future events, including for our future? Are they around Christ's second coming, the end of the world, and the so-called rapture? Again, an essential verse to understand this is verse 34 and the parallel verse, Mark 13:30 and Luke 21:32, which says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Therefore, we must conclude that all the events described up to verse 34 will come during that time, during that generation, and are not referring to Christ's second coming or the end of the world, which obviously did not happen before that generation passed away. So let's unpack this chapter. In my Bible, there's a man-written heading above verse 1 that says, Signs of Christ's Return. And yet most, and possibly all of this chapter, is not about Christ's return or the second coming. The context here, as in the Mark and Luke accounts, is the temple buildings, and the foretelling of their destruction. A compelling case can be made, and again, I'm not going to pound my fist, this thing is entirely too hard, but a compelling case can be made that all of Matthew 24 until at least verse 36 or 42 and all of Mark 13 is entirely about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. In fact, Jesus may not be transitioning to the topic of the second coming, which is the second judgment, until Matthew 25, where it's a case of, since we're talking about one judgment, let's talk about the final judgment. Jesus is saying that not one stone of the temple buildings will be left standing. This is about the coming destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, which occurred in about the year 70 AD and was prophesied in the book of Daniel, chapter 9. As we will see, there will be signs of this event, whereas the second coming will be at a time when no one expects, like a thief in the night, as 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 2 Peter 3:10 say. So note in these first three verses that multiple questions from his disciples are recorded here. First one is, when will these things happen? The context is the destruction of the temple, what Jesus just foretold. And note that these things, the phrase these things, is found in multiple places in this chapter, in verses 3, 6, 8, 33, and as pointed out in verse 34. And it's a key to understanding what the context is of what's being discussed. The second question is, what will be the sign of your coming? Basically, what to look for. And this coming could be coming in judgment. And the third question, what will be the sign of the end of the age? Again, basically asking what to look for. Note it says the end of the age, not the end of the world. The end of the age is likely the end of the Jewish age, the Mosaic period, the Old Law, the Old Testament age. It's possible that in the disciples' minds that all of these questions and events would happen at the same time, because for them, the destruction of the temple could be seen as the end of the age, or even as the end of the world, or at least their world. But Jesus separates them out over time with phrases like, that is not yet the end, nor ever will. Immediately after the tribulation in verse 29, and then the sign in verse 30, all of which indicates that time will continue beyond these events. So this is not the end of the world. Note that in the parallel section of Mark 13:4 and Luke 21:7 accounts, just two questions are asked, and both of them are specifically about the destruction of the temple and the signs for when that would happen. So perhaps that's a clue that this Matthew 24 account is also specific to that context. Verses 4 through 14, we notice the following things. False prophets will be prevalent. False messiahs will lead people astray. Jesus gives signs for the coming judgment, the destruction of Jerusalem, over the next several verses, talking about false Christ, wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, persecutions and tribulations, and the abomination of desolation. These are all signs that they could see and know, like how to see and read a fig tree in verses 32 to 33. These events did, in fact, occur and were recorded in secular history by men known as Josephus, Tacitus, and Marcellus. In verse 6, notice that those things are these things from verse 3 about the temple and its destruction and of Jerusalem. And when those things or these things happen, it says that is not yet the end. Therefore, those things or these things, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, are a separate event that will happen before this generation passes away, according to verse 34. And in other words, they will be happening relatively soon for them before the end of their generation. Verse 8 says, all of these things, there's our these things again, are merely the beginning. These events will transpire over a period of time. It's not the sudden end of the world or the second coming. Verse 9 in the parallel account in Mark, which is 13:9, says, you will be flogged in the synagogues. And Luke 21:12 talks about them delivering you to the synagogues, neither of which a Christian needs to worry about today. These are among several tribulations that we read about in verses 9 to 12, all still time boxed within verse 34. Again, all of this was about the persecution of the Jews in Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple that would take place in 70 AD, in their future, not ours. Verse 13 says, the one who endures to the end. This refers to those who will survive to the end of these perilous times. The parallel verse in Luke 21:19 says, by your endurance, you will gain your lives. So some will survive this. This is not the end of the world. Verse 14 says, the gospel will be preached to the whole world before the end comes. The whole world, in this case, likely refers to the Roman world, which was the known world at that time. So the gospel message, the kingdom, will be preached first in their whole world before these signs or events happen. Then the end will come. That is, the end of the Mosaic period, the Old Testament, old law age. And with that, it was replaced with the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of Christ that has been preached to the whole world. In verses 15 to 18, these are signs for them at that time for them to be on the alert for. These signs were limited to their time, their generation, as we saw in verse 34. They're also limited in scope to Jerusalem, Judea, those who are in the country, and those who are in the midst of the city. And the city is identified as Jerusalem. It says, when you see the Roman army gathering, it is time to flee from Jerusalem and head for the hills because it will be destroyed. Unlike for the second coming or the end of the world, there will be signs for the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. Most notably, the Abomination of Desolation, which is an intriguing term. It refers to the Roman army which were the ones who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Compare this also to Luke 21:20. It says, but when you see Jerusalem, very specific, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. This also points back to Matthew 23:38, where Jesus said, behold, your house, referring to Jerusalem, is being left to you desolate. The Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, entered it, and destroyed it. They also entered and destroyed the temple, which was an abomination and a desolation. On a day they would see the signs described in this chapter, they were to flee. There would be days that would follow that, so it's not the end of the world, but this would be a punishment foretold that would mark the end of the Jewish age. There are many clues here that this judgment was a local event, limited in time, and not a global event that marked the end of time. Verse 16 says, those who are in Judea. This was a physical judgment that you could escape from. If this were talking about the end of the world, there's no point to flee to the mountains. If this was talking about Jesus' return, then why would we flee? None of these instructions are relevant if we're talking about the end of the world and final judgment. Verse 17 says, whoever is on the housetop. This is a cultural indicator of those times when the housetop was used by people as living space. If we're talking about the end of the world, then why would anyone get the things that are get the things in their house out of their house? Verse 18, whoever is in the field must not turn back to the city to get his cloak, where they would be taken by the calamity of the destruction of Jerusalem. They should instead flee to the mountains. If talking about the end of the world, then why would anyone need or want their cloak? Verse 19, being pregnant or having nursing babies would make that escape more difficult. But notice also it says the days, plural, not day in verse 19, as in a judgment day or the day of the second coming. Verse 20, we learn that they were advised that winter would make it more difficult to escape from Jerusalem. But that's not a factor if we're talking about the end of the world. It doesn't matter if the end of the world happens in middle of winter or in the heat of summer. But if this were talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it would be more difficult if that were in winter. They had to escape. And this will also happen when the culture is still observing the Sabbath. The city gates will be closed on the Sabbath, making it difficult to escape. Verse 22, these events will end before everyone is dead. It says these days were cut short so that not everyone would be killed, so some could survive. Again, this isn't the end of the world. So verses 23 through 26, we have more warnings about false Christs and false prophets. Verse 27 does contain the phrase, the coming of the Son of Man. But because of the time boxing of verse 34, all these things will happen during this generation. This coming is likely referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, a judgment of Jesus that will take place in this generation long before the final judgment. And in verse 28, this corpse is referring to Jerusalem due to the sins that separated them from God. And the vultures are the Roman army that will destroy Jerusalem and did so, as mentioned in AD 70. Again, in my Bible, the heading for starting in verse 29 says the glorious return. Again, this is a man-written description of the set of verses, but it's not accurate. I'm not saying the Bible's not accurate. I'm saying a man's interpretation or man's commentary above these verses is not an accurate representation of what those next verses are, the inspired next verses are saying. Again, while it says the glorious return in my Bible, an essential verse again is verse 34, which says this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So in verse 29, notice that Jesus said immediately after the tribulation of those days. So we're still in that time period. All of these things will happen during their time and generation. There are things that will happen after those tribulations. This is not the end of the world, though to some it must have felt like it. The next verses sound as if we're talking about the end of the world, verses 29 to 32 roughly, but consider the fact that this is prophetic, symbolic, figurative language that's quoted from the Old Testament. And it's consistent with previous times when God judged nations, such as in Isaiah 13 regarding the destruction of Babylon. Jesus used descriptions that would get the attention of his audience and that would resonate with them about the coming disasters that would happen in their generation. These events of these catastrophes were recorded in history. In fact, there's an ancient book called Wars, and a couple of quotes from that are, again, speaking of what happened in those events of those times, there broke out a prodigious storm in the night with the utmost of violence, very strong winds with the largest showers of rain, with continual lightnings, terrible thunderings, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth. And that was an earthquake. These things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men when a system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshadowed some great calamities that were coming. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also, before the Jews' rebellion, so great a light shone round the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. So these are some of the events that were recorded and descriptions of those events that did happen in that time that are consistent with the warnings Jesus gave in colorful prophetic language that would get their attention. And also consider the raining down of fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sure that seemed like the end of the world as well. In verses 30 and 31, we see more prophetic language about a judgment. But notice it says then, in other words, sometime later, sometime afterwards. It says the sign of the Son of Man. It appears that this coming is not the second coming or the final judgment because that event will have no signs. It will be like a thief in the night. This may be indicating that the Lord is seen in his judgments, also like how we see the power of God in storms. It made me think of Forrest Gump when the hurricane hit and Forrest said, God answered. So God answers in storms. We see his power in the storms. We see his power in judgments. Verse 31, his elect are those the elect referred to there are those who chose to believe and obey him. They were spared the destruction of Jerusalem, but it was still a judgment. The center of the Jewish religion was destroyed, but this freed up the gospel to take flight. Verses 32 to 35 continue talking about these things, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Look for the signs of what is going to come. That's the message. They can be seen and recognized. When you see all these things, and Mark 13:29 and Luke 21:31 add happening, when you see these things happening, these things are those things that were described all the way back to verse 3. And it says that he or it is near when you see these things happening. It says, so it's here, not here, but near. Okay, these things are near. The Luke account adds, when you see these things happening, recognize that the kingdom of God is near. the church, what Jesus came to establish, not some political or social or militaristic kingdom. Note also in Luke 17, in verse 20, it says, the kingdom of God, it's the kingdom of God that is being asked about. And it's the Pharisees in that account, asking the question. So when will the kingdom of God appear was the question. And again, notice in verse 32 that they were expected to read what was coming. They were just like they would be able to read a fig tree and know when to expect fruit. Okay, so we're now finally to verse 34, if you're still with me. And again, this verse is critical to answering and understanding questions in this chapter. It time boxes all predictions and events up until at least here, as does these things in verses 3, 6, 8, and 33, to take place before the end of that generation. This is about the persecution of the Jews and the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem that came during this generation, which is their generation, within the next 30 to 40 years, around AD 70. Again, it's not the end of the world. So I will mention for your consideration that verse 36, or maybe verse 42, or even down to Matthew 25, again, not pounding the table here, but at least verse 36, there appears to be a transition to at least include talking about the end of the world or the second coming. So I've got a little table here that contrasts up to verse 36 in the left column from verse 36 in the right column, where prior to verse 36 we're talking about days that you'll know, abnormal times are happening, warnings, and so forth, where after verse 36 it talks about day singular, the day of the Lord, and we know not when that will happen, and times seem normal, people are getting married and having food and that kind of thing, and there's no warning. So I'll leave that for your consideration to take a look at the before and after shift that we see, contrasting between before and after verse 36. One couple verses I want to make sure I get to is that verses 40 and 42. It's popular to tie these two verses to the end of the world and to the idea of what people like to call the rapture. But let me suggest that a case can be made that these verses are still referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Those in the field in this verse can be better understood when tied to the one in the field in verse 18, and then also compared to Mark 13:16, where the one in the field must not turn back to the city to get his coat, where they would be killed in the destruction of Jerusalem, that they should instead flee to the mountains. Notice also some other clues in these two verses, that they say that those two people, the one in the field and the one grinding, are taken. That is likely meaning that they were exiled and carried off into captivity. In fact, Luke 21:24, the parallel account, references captivity. Or it could be that they're killed, but it doesn't say that they're left on the earth. Perhaps some or half of those that are in Jerusalem will be carried off into captivity or die. But if we're talking about the second coming or the final judgment or the end of the world, then no one will be left. Note also that in Luke 21:36, it corresponds to verse 42, and Mark 13:33, but it adds, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that are about to take place. So this must be referring to the persecutions with the destruction of Jerusalem that Jesus warned about, and not to the end of the world. Because of those two events, that's the only one you would want to and possibly could escape from. So just to summarize verses 42 to 51, these could admittedly be referring to either or both judgments. But the message for us, the lesson for us, the takeaway for all of this for us is that we need to be ready and we need to be prepared and we need not to be careless or complacent when it comes to when the Lord comes where we're concerned. So the conclusion is that Matthew 24 contains some challenging content. But fortunately, we have parallel accounts that help shed some light and clarify some things where you may be tempted to look one direction instead of the other. These things, the phrase these things in verses 3, 6, 8, 33, and especially verse 34 appear to be about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But regardless, both the destruction of the temple and the second coming are judgments of God. The first judgment has signs, such as the Abomination of Desolation, starting with the massing of the Roman army. The second judgment, the second coming, the end of the world, won't have signs. The destruction of Jerusalem is also described as a coming of Jesus, a judgment, but not the final judgment, not the second coming, not the end of the world. So again, that's the lesson for us, to be ready, to be prepared, that we know not when the day for our future will happen, when the Lord will come. So the lesson is now yours, and my final admonition is that there is a great day coming for us, and that we need to be ready for our coming judgment. And we also, until that happens, need to take the opportunity to teach that other person in the field or that person grinding at the mill while there's still time. If you're not yet a Christian, then you are not yet ready and you are not yet prepared. You need to be buried, and we encourage you to be buried with Christ in baptism, which is when and where his blood washes away your sins. If we can assist you in any way, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.